There's a lot of uncertainty, but we know already that it will have a changing effect, changing on economies, societies. The effect will be much similar to World War, and actually all countries in the world are affected.
Peter, who said in the first chapter of his second letter to the church, he said that prophecy is not a matter of one's own interpretation. And there becomes the danger, because speculation is fine, but when we begin to speculate and say, my speculation is accurate, a speculation is what it sounds like. It's kind of a informed guess. You're informed and you're looking at things and saying, this makes sense and this could be, but without some very, very definite things in place, we might be just howling at the wind.
Well, there's a rare sight in the skies this week, a newly discovered comet.
A 3-mile-wide comet named Neowise is passing by Earth in July and August and won't return for more than 6,000 years.
Planet Earth has a visitor right now, about 64 million miles away. Many have been captivated by the beauty and the brightness of Comet Neowise.
For the past few weeks, stargazers have captured it over Stonehenge, Ireland, even the Rio Grande, and now it's our turn.
You referenced Antarctica. And so it's not just an economic fragility that you're dealing with. We're looking at environmental fragility, even social fragility. And you're predicting that we're going to have a very, very hard decade, that we're going to enter in a period which is, catastrophically worse in some ways than the Great Depression. Tell us what you see coming.
Unfortunately, the response to that realization sometimes was intemperate. And I want to be kind here, but despite the fact that Jesus clearly warned that no man, he said, would know the day or the hour, many, many, many have attempted to fill in that blank. And they have all sorts of arguments. But what is essential to remember, as Jesus' warning reveals to us about the day and the hour, that prophecy is essentially time sensitive. In other words, it's spoken not in some kind of vague, generalized sense, like books like the Nostradamus or the Urantia that supposedly give these prophetic foretellings. But if you read them, they're so vague and so broad and so flexible, you can make them apply to just about any other time in history you want to. And so people always get excited about it. Every once in a while, you'll see all this stuff showing up on the internet, how the book of Urantia foretold this, Nostradamus foretold this, and then you read what he foretold, and it sounds like something I could foretell. And rather being good for foretelling, it's better for fertilizer. But prophecy is time sensitive. It speaks about specific times affecting specific groups of places and people and persons in specific places. It isn't vague and generalized. It has such a specificity to it that it's really hard to find any wiggle room. It either comes to pass exactly as the prophet said it would, or it has no application whatsoever. And it's for that reason that we need to have kind of a carefulness when we're talking about the biblical prophecy and its fulfillment. Because the book of Revelation has so many symbols and allegories, for centuries Bible scholars have argued over how literal our reading of the text should actually be. And that spawned different schools of philosophy or theory about how the book should be read, whether it's purely allegorical or it's partly allegorical. It should be taken literally in some places and not literally in other places. And this has been an interesting discussion that kind of came to a short stop very, very quickly around the turn of the 19th century. Because what happened was 3 unforeseen, unprecedented events took place in your world history, beginning first with the rise of Zionism, the idea that Jews essentially around the world said, we don't have a place where we feel we are included. As much as they had tried to blend into other cultures, they were always held off, first by an obvious bigotry or anti-Semitism, but in some ways God said this would be the judgment that the Jews would face. Now, we have a hard time many times getting our mind around the idea that God would allow for bigotry or allow for something like anti-Semitism, and yet it's the very thing that God knew would make them never feel at home any place except back in the land that he had given to them. But secondly, this was followed eventually by the rebirth of Israel as a nation in 1948 when the UN voted them in and basically for the first time in history declared a nation to be a nation, it being accomplished in one day as foretold by the prophet Isaiah. And then finally with the conquest and the reoccupation of the city of Jerusalem in 1967, those things foretold by Jesus in Luke 21 when he said, when you see Jerusalem is no longer trodden down by the Gentiles, you know the time of the Gentile nations has come to a close or is coming to a close. To many of these and other significant events seem to really meet the biblical requirements of the gospel. When Jesus' disciples asked him the question, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Many of us, especially of the biblicist, evangelical persuasion, began to step back and say, wow, this is indeed notable. This is unprecedented. We can't find another example in the history of the earth where something like this has taken place.
So we decided to favor a holistic approach, considering that in today's world it doesn't make any sense to have a silo approach. The reality is that the world is completely concatenated, so if just one word were to define today's world, it would be interdependence. We live in a world of systemic connectivity, meaning that the risks conflict with each other. So the main findings of the book, I think, pertain to the fact that risks create ricochet cascading effects.
I mean, after all, the name Japan in Japanese literally translates the land of the rising sun. And so the kings of the East, or really the word Anatole in Hebrew or Greek that's used in Revelation 16, means the land of the rising sun. I mean, they said this is a perfect fit. It's got to be Japan. It's got to be the axis of Germany and Japan and Italy and so forth. This is the sign that the Antichrist is coming. And let me tell you, there's no question that people like Tojo and Hitler were Antichrist personalities, and Mussolini on top of it all. But time came and time went, and they passed from history and suddenly realized, well, they seem to fit so well, but obviously they aren't the Antichrist, and this isn't the kingdom of the beast that's being formed. Because I don't think that that's given to us. In fact, one of the things that Paul told us in 2 Thessalonians 2:8 is that we would only know when the lawless one is revealed. And he's speaking in the context of the very end times, the middle of the tribulation. So questions like, is Russia Gog and Magog? Or is China the kings of the East? Are matters of conjecture. They're not matters of absolute certainty. Even though at various times they may fit the thing to a T, I would just caution you to say that don't hatch those eggs before they're ready. Yet what I am certain about is that there never has been a time in human history that more closely conforms to the Bible's description of the end times than the world we're in today. You've heard me say this many times, but when we look at the big picture of things, one world government, one world economy, one world religion, there's never been an opportunity for those things to coalesce all together at one time in a very literal and real way. And that has convinced many of us to take the book of Revelation in a extremely literal reading and interpretation, and not just simply in symbolic gestures. And knowing that we may get a clear picture of what those symbols mean as those days come closer and closer. But one of the things that I would caution us is not to fall into that attitude of heart of saying, well, you know, I've lived through many dates and they haven't come, and therefore I don't even believe in end times prophecy anymore, as I've had some people tell me. In my opinion, the only thing that stands between today and the end of all things is God's timings and God's purpose. And when we talk about God's approach to time, you have to understand not only did God create time, you know, when he cast the stars and the moon, he said these were for measuring of days and weeks and months and seasons, that God says, I'm creating time. I'm creating this dynamic called time. And the reality is, he says, I can take time and I can compress it and make things happen much faster than we imagine, and I can stretch time and allow them to cover longer periods of time. And the most important thing we need to understand is we don't know which is which. It'll only take place when, as Paul said to the Thessalonians, the one who now holds back will continue to do so till he's taken out of the way. Again, a lot of discussion as to who the he is, but ultimately, whoever the he is, whether it's a person or a spirit or the Holy Spirit or it's the church, ultimately it's God himself who is in controlling of those dynamics, and until he allows those things to move forward, they will not move forward.